Hi to all our podcast subscribers. Thank you for making our May Day to Memorial Day membership drive such a success. Also to our lovely listeners who are yet to become members, it is not too late. Join our inner circle by becoming a patron today for as little as $3 a month. Patrons receive audio extras, research materials for each episode, and more. Independent media is not actually independent, you see. We're in fact dependent on you to bring you all that we do without ads and with music. Go to patreon.com, The LF Show, to become a member today. And now, here's this week's program. Hi, I'm Laura Flanders, and this is The Laura Flanders Show, the TV and radio program that seeks to raise radical spirits by interviewing forward-thinking people with real-life models of shifting power from the few to the many in the worlds of arts, entrepreneurship, and governance. 400 years since the first enslaved Africans arrived in Jamestown, many people agree that reparations are due. But what would that look like? How about affordable property in black hands in perpetuity? Could community land trusts be a way of making repair? A lawyer, a policy advocate, and an organizer with homeless New Yorkers talk about what's possible and what's happening. Next, on The Laura Flanders Show, the place where the people who say it can't be done take a back seat to the people who are doing it. Every year for 30 years, Representative John Conyers introduced a bill calling for the U.S. government to study providing reparations to African Americans for slavery. Congress hasn't acted yet, but this year has already seen more Democrats talking about reparations than ever, including several running for the presidency. Now, rather than writing checks to individuals, more and more people are talking about collective strategies for repair and reparation. Community land trusts, cooperatives, and mutual housing associations, for example, might offer a way to transfer some long-promised land and rights to America's black communities while making today's housing economy less speculative. Do land trusts actually model a doable way of repairing the damage of the past while simultaneously creating a more equitable economy going forward? Just possibly. Joining us to discuss those possibilities are Cothren Franke. She's the author of a new book, Repair, Redeeming the Promise of Abolition. Kathy Albisa, co-founder and executive director of NESTRI, that's the National Economic and Social Rights Initiative, and Jaritza Geigel. She's a senior organizer for Picture the Homeless, a grassroots organization founded and led by homeless people, which advocates for social justice on issues like housing and what they call the shelter industrial complex. Welcome, everybody. So glad to have you. Let's start with a little history. I hate to do this to you, Cothren, but, people don't know the history. They don't get taught it. So when we're talking about repair, when we're talking about reparations for slavery, some might say, well, wasn't there Reconstruction? Didn't slavery end?
Well, in your middle school social studies class or your history class, you get the story of we fought a civil war over slavery, the slaves were freed, there was Reconstruction that sort of rebuilt the economy of the South, and then here we are today, and that's all that was owed. But what actually happened is that people were emancipated, were freed from slavery into a condition of abject poverty, into a kind of world where white supremacy and violent racism still structured their lives. And part of what I wanted to do with Repair is return to that history and illuminate the ways in which even Northern military officials saw it as necessary to provide reparations in the form of land to freed people, both as a way to recognize the horrible torture, theft, rape, death, separation of families that structured slavery, but also to make freedom a reality, a practical reality for freed people to have some resources as they began and rebuilt free lives. So we've done it. We've done it in this country, but we don't know it. So part of what the book is designed to do is repair that history, is to bring us back to that period and see that this was doable then, and it was seen as necessary to what it meant to emancipate freed people.
Now, Jerry, to you, you work with people that are dealing with very urgent needs and concerns. Does this history resonate? Does it have life today?
Absolutely. I look ambiguous, but being a black young woman myself and understanding my heritage and my ancestry and where it all leads to, we're living in, modern day colonial times of what people being displaced, or actually land being stolen and continue to being occupied this day by the descendants of European settlers look like, and the impact of that, right? So I'm now in Bushwick, that has been gentrified for over the last 20 years, and any month now you can be priced out. I've had to watch many family members move out of the neighborhoods, go to surrounding like Jersey City to try to go to more affordable places, and then you're even beginning to see those surrounding areas in the tri-state beginning to become even more priced out because of gentrification and how folks are continuously being displaced and then entering either the streets and trying to survive that, or enter the shelter industrial complex that really it's not a home, and it hasn't really guaranteed any real sustainable pathway for folks getting out of shelter and back into permanent housing for folks, and let alone have ownership over those homes.
I'm hearing a lot of resonance here. Kathy, your organization recently released something called the New Social Contract that knits together a picture of the future that could be different. But how do you connect to this history?
Some of the concepts that struck me most powerfully in Cothren's book, because I was really excited as I was reading it. One prong of our New Social Contract work is land, housing, and natural resources. And we work with Picture the Homeless on some of these issues, really advancing the notion of community control and collective ownership of land. For those who don't know, a community land trust is land that is owned collectively, but the houses are owned individually by families, and so they are building equity, you are building wealth, but you're doing so outside of the speculative economy. There is a contract, there's an agreement amongst all the neighbors, residents, the community land trust, to keep the housing permanently affordable. This is what prevents the ongoing displacement that you were describing. Now, what struck me about Cothren's book, because I was reading two concepts that, for me, knitted together why this is such a powerful conversation and how important it is now in order to really rethink how we talk about land, housing, and even natural resources. Cothren talked about recovering possible futures. The idea that there were people even then who knew this was the right thing to do, to give reparations, to give it in a concrete form of land, the land people had been working for years, if not generations. And it was abruptly cut off, right? It was abruptly cut off by the white supremacy that pushed us off that path. And to recover that possible future, the other concept he talks about in the book is we need to understand the difference between history and memory. So we've relegated it to history, but we haven't really embedded it in our cultural memory. So how can you fix something if you have collective amnesia and you refuse to face it? So excavating and recovering this memory, making it part, making our history and our memory whole again, allows us to think about this model in a real way. It would be really wonderful as a form of reparations, but it would actually be good, as most things are that are just, for the entire country.
Yeah.
So let me come back to you, Cothren. I mean, if people do have a memory, they have a memory that people were intending to do something along the lines of repair and was stopped, as Kathy just said. This didn't happen.
Well, it actually did in the Sea Islands area, and then in another area just outside of Vicksburg. Land was seized from the Confederate plantation owners when they fled. So that land was seized, and then it was explicitly and intentionally reallocated to freed people in 40-acre units, which is where we get that term today of 40 acres and a mule. With the understanding that this is how you'll begin your new lives on this land. And actually, the general's order that allowed for those allocations barred white people from entering those communities. And the idea was, you people need to heal. And you're going to heal and empower yourselves separate from white people. And it was a beautiful and exciting idea. But as soon as Lincoln was assassinated, the new president came in, took all that land back, and gave it to the former slave owners, and then required that freed people enter into year-long labor contracts with the people who had owned them before. So they reinstituted a form of legalized slavery just under another name.
With the black codes.
With the black codes and all of that. As Michelle Alexander talks about the new Jim Crow, this is the seeds of that were taking place in the immediate post-war period, but for a little window of time, there was a whole nother model.
Now, that window did extend in certain parts of the country with the growth of black towns that were pretty successful until massive white backlash and white supremacist violence moving right through to the 1920s, even 50s.
Absolutely. There were a few towns, largely African-American towns of freed people, sort of peppered through the South, but by and large, those communities of black people were driven out through lynching, from just straight up murder with a gun, through just terror, racial terror that took place in what we think is this period of wonderful Reconstruction. It actually was a period of racial terror that drove what we understand to be the Great Migration of formerly enslaved people, African Americans, to the North, to being locked into multi-generations of real poverty. So if people had had land, had the ability to build firm economic lives in the immediate post-war period, we would see the economy in a very different racially stratified way today. And what we've done instead is lock people into this sort of permanent condition of poverty, which, because we haven't acknowledged this collective responsibility, we individualize it as if it's each black person's fault.
Do you want to talk a little bit more about those two models that are central to your story, the Sea Islands in South Carolina, and is it Davis Bend?
Davis Bend. So Jefferson Davis, who was the president of the Confederacy, he and his brother owned a huge plantation right outside of Vicksburg. And as soon as General Grant moved into that area with the Northern troops and all of the white people, the Confederates, had to leave, black people took over. They ran the plantations. They were allocated land. It was explicitly understood that this would be a kind of black haven, a haven of an experiment in freedom. Similar thing took place in the Sea Islands. All of the white people fled when the Northern troops came in, and the Northern military saw a kind of human horror that shook them to their core by facing what slavery looked like, the kind of condition that the enslaved people presented themselves to the Northern military, sick, hungry, with no clothing. And they were so incredibly moved that we have to do something to repair this situation. It implicates us. Mere emancipation is not enough. And so 40-acre plots of land were allocated to families. And what's really interesting is that folks tended to live in collective units, not just nuclear families, because that's how they had been living before, and also the way that slavery split families up. There were complicated kinship relationships, multiple parents.
Survival strategies, too.
Absolutely. And so the idea that we would today return to that idea of collective community ownership reflects also what was going on in that period.
Jeannie, are there what-ifs running through your head as you hear these stories? And did you know them? I didn't know them.
There are no what-ifs that were through my story. Like, this is going back to when, as you were saying, right, when black farmers in the South kind of like started this whole thought process of community living and community, like land trust, if you want to think about it. This goes back to Native Indigenous practices, where our thought and the way we viewed land, it was like this collective ownership where we could all live and be prosperous and have long-term sustainability. So for me, it's like, it's not a dream. It's not something that's too far out of reach. This is something that is possible. This is one out of many tools that our communities can benefit from. This is not a new concept. People across the country are using this form as a way to, maintain affordable ways of living right now.
This is the Laura Flanders Show. I'm Laura. My guests are Professor Cothren Franke, Director of Columbia University's Center for Gender, Sexuality, and Law. She's also author of a new book, Repair, Redeeming the Promise of Abolition. Jeritza Geigel, Senior Organizer with Picture the Homeless, which advocates for social justice on issues like housing. And Catherine Albisa, Executive Director of the National Economic and Social Rights Initiative, or NESRI. Take a moment to sign up for our weekly e-newsletter at lauraflanders.org and follow us on social media. While you're there, subscribe to our podcast to receive audio exclusives like my regular commentary, The F Word. The latest I wrote while in Spain for the first time, reflecting on the 80th anniversary of that country's brutal civil war. After the music break, we continue the conversation here on land trusts as a vehicle for reparations. Kathy Albisa interrogates the question, what is freedom for communities of color? Here's Waiting for the Sun by Mel Tonix, released on Kid Recordings.
Waiting for the sun to hit me on my face.
Kathy?
I think the other thing that it should cause us to think about is sort of interrogate what we think of as freedom.
Yeah.
You make a distinction in the book between being free and being freed.
Yeah.
So people were freed, but they weren't free. And none of us are free right now, right? Not in this economy and not in this political system. The collectivity that was being practiced in those two spaces, the Sea and Islands and Davis Bend, that was a form of being free, not just freed. And the collectivity we can practice today, you had mentioned our new social contract project. If you look at all 5 prongs, it's a way of acting collectively so we can actually be free. Right. And we need to understand not only is there no contradiction between that, one is absolutely impossible without the other.
Catherine, to you, I mean, it's beautiful what Kathy is doing here, but I can't help thinking, and we'll come back to you on this too, Kathy, of course, there was a white supremacist backlash then. This feels like a white supremacist revival moment now. What makes you think this conversation is ripe for this second?
Well, we've never experienced a period where white supremacy didn't structure our political, economic, legal lives. What I find surprising, and I certainly didn't think this as I was writing the book, or starting to write the book 10 years ago, is that the issue of reparations is actually a legitimate conversation right now. You've noted there's been a bill introduced into Congress year after year after year, not to deliver reparations, but just to study it. And they couldn't even get a hearing on it. The bill is now getting a hearing. Every person who's running for president from the Democratic Party is talking seriously about reparations. Actually, if they don't have a position, they look like they're actually not with the program. So to say that white supremacists won't have a reaction to these proposals and to the serious consideration of reparations would be to ignore the power of white supremacy, but something has broken out here.
I've heard Elizabeth Warren, I've heard Kamala Harris. Bernie Sanders was terrible on this last time around, although I was very positively disposed to him generally, but he was terrible on this. Has he changed?
He's gotten better. You know, he's evolving on a lot of things that have to do with racial justice. It's not where his heart lies, I think. Economic justice in a way that doesn't figure racial justice at its core, as I think of all our work does, is not really a comfortable place for him, but he's working on it. So he did describe reparations earlier as divisive, but he's walked that back, and he's now talking about it in a different way. And I have to say, the community land trusts, the sort of collective ways of thinking property, have to figure in some important way in the way that we undertake reparations, but they aren't the only thing.
Sure.
Right? There are all sorts of just knowing the history, museums, apology, other ways of taking down the statues around the country of Confederate heroes. To me, these are all part of an emerging collective reckoning with the enduring intergenerational injury of slavery.
But apology without action wouldn't be enough.
Right, and action has to actually address the underlying structures, because our society, our economy, our politic is structured in a highly racialized way, right? And it affects all people of color, but it is really, my opinion, centered around anti-blackness.
Yes.
And you know, we cannot leave out the project to wipe out indigenous people too, right? Those two grave kind of original sins are constantly in tension with what are really a set of beautiful ideals of equality, fraternity, liberty. And that has been our historic wrestling, right? How do we square that circle? And we cannot square it until we do what you're talking about, have a serious reckoning with it and engage it and respond to it, both on the level of narrative and on the level of structure.
But I also think it's essential that white people take responsibility for the advantages that we have been born into. So it's not only an issue of addressing the disadvantage that African American people have had in this country, but the fact that we're seeing the largest intergenerational transfer of wealth taking place right now as the people of my parents' generation are dying, and we're dropping the estate tax so that accumulated advantage, wealth, leg up, boots that you can have straps on that can actually pull your life up economically, is all built on the fact that there was property, there was economic advantage that was part of what it meant to be white in this country that we have to take responsibility for, which is why I recommend in the book that we raise the estate tax considerably and we tax that, what I think is a windfall for people like me, and use that money to fund what a substantial reparations project would look like.
I mean, it's often the case that our sort of civil rights accomplishments are measured in terms of wage and income improvements and shrinkage of the disparity in wage differentials. It's on this issue of wealth and property ownership and ability to make decisions around property and inheritance that you really see the legacy of slavery. Tell us some more about what's actually happening in East Harlem. I mean, there is a community land trust in the works. Talk about what's going on right here, right now. This isn't pie in the sky.
In 2017, through the enterprise grant that the city rolled out like an RFP, a request for interest, and we won. We were one of the groups, but it was $1.6 million divided between 3 other organizations. And so $500,000 is a lot for one person if you're thinking about it, but it really is not enough. And so we were able to get 2 buildings, if I'm remembering correctly. We managed to like own the land that it's on. And so what happened is we helped create a mutual housing association with residents, folks who, we actually sit on the board. So there's like 2 nonprofit organizations that sit on the board of it. And we also have like electeds that can also like be a part of the board. So we have all different stakeholders that are a part of it. And they make the collective decisions around what kind of repairs are needed, what are the financial fiscal responsibilities that we need, who are the professionals that we may need to be bringing on board who can actually help us move this work forward in an intentional way. And that's still in the works, right? One of the things that we're trying to advocate more for is that folks are going to need more financial support for these mutual housing associations to actually get a lot of the work.
Well, that's where some of this reparations might come in. Kathy?
Yeah, I just also wanted to point out that while community land trusts and other shared equity models are a very small slice of our housing in the country, there are 200 community land trusts around the country. Yes. And there have been some around for decades. And what's important to know about them is they work spectacularly well overall. When the foreclosure crisis hit, the community land trusts were barely touched. The foreclosure rate in community land trusts were very, very tiny. If you subsidize a family for buying a home in a community land trust, 90% of them are still in their private home 5 years later. If you subsidize a family to buy a home in the private market, only 50% are in their own home 5 years later. So we know the model works. This is not a theory, this is not an experiment, this is something that's been done for a long time. What we need is the political commitment to take land out of the speculative economy and create stability and thriving neighborhoods.
Well, it's happening in different communities in different ways. New York is, particularly Manhattan and Harlem, is a very dense place where gentrification sort of structures the real estate market entirely. So to hold back a couple of buildings is a big thing, but it may not be transformative in the community. But if you go to Jackson, Mississippi, where they're also experimenting a lot with community land trusts, what they're doing there, as in Detroit and other cities, where there are just vast parts of the city that have been abandoned, right? There are no services, there's no one living there, very few people living there. It's a way to recapture those communities. And not through gentrification, not through what you see in so many cities where they build a new downtown and then the yuppies come back from the suburbs and then all the folks who were living there have nowhere to go and end up in shelters. What you're doing is you're repairing the very idea of the city itself through community land ownership and community control, rather than real estate developers who have no investment in the long-term health or culture of a city.
So how could our conversation, what you're calling for around the conversation, if only the conversation around reparations, but also the actual concrete money, how could that conversation shift change the reality on the ground? I'm thinking of Shirley Sherrod, the former Ag Secretary, who we had on the program a few years ago talking about one of the first community land trusts in the United States that came out of the civil rights movement and that she was involved in Georgia. It's one of the largest in the South still. What they were up against on a daily basis from the Agriculture Department, from pretty much every agency of government at the national, regional, and local level, not to mention just vigilantes, was nothing ordinary. Could this conversation that you're engaging in shift in a way that actually made it safer and more doable for people on the ground?
I think so, because when these sorts of experiments take place on a kind of ad hoc basis here and there in the little cracks in a community, they're so vulnerable to the violence, the backlash of white supremacists or just speculators, who often may be the same people in some communities. But when it's a national conversation, or at least a larger community conversation about a deliberate effort to repair cities, repair communities, through what are, as Kathy Albisa explains, really tried and true experiments around collective land ownership, it provides a kind of safety, I think, for those experiments, not as just random ad hoc anomalies, but actually a new model of the city. You know, Hudson Yards is a great example of an enormous failure of the idea of a speculative real estate development project on steroids. Everyone in the city hates this new thing, this new sort of symbol of wealth, and it's just an awful thing. And so the contrast to that are the kind of values that underwrite community land trusts.
Hudson Yards being a massive development on the west side of Manhattan that got a lot of city support and is really all about commerce, with a little art thrown in. We have a practice nowadays of saying, what do you think is the story the future will tell of this moment? In a nutshell, what do you think? And then I'll come to you,
I think
Teresa.
the future is for us to write, right? They talk about the history bend towards justice, but it's not a law of physics, right? It depends on the kind of commitment and energy that we put into it. But I know the future people are working very hard to write. And in that future, we are sharing risk. It's income solidarity, it's risk solidarity, it's public responsibility to meet basic needs. It's collective community control, and it's really a new vision of democracy, where democracy is not just showing up at the ballot box, which not even that's working these days, but it's beyond the ballot box, right? It's democracy beyond elections, where people actually have agency to shape their lives, their institutions, and their country.
Echoing all that, and I agree. I think folks have had enough. The energy is there. I think the more we intentionally begin to really center, because I think you hit it on the nose, is that there's a lot of it comes out of this anti-Black narrative. And I think that the moment we begin to, as we continue, I want to say, really put Black issues at the heart of all the issues that we're talking about, then we'll actually see some changes begin to happen.
I want to thank you all. We're out of time, but this conversation will continue on this program. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Laura.
That was Jaritza Geigel, Senior Organizer with Picture the Homeless, Kathy Albisa, Executive Director of the National Economic and Social Rights Initiative, and Professor Cothren Franke, Director of Columbia University's Center for Gender, Sexuality, and Law. Her new book is Repair, Redeeming the Promise of Abolition. You can find more information on all of my guests, along with my research materials, at patreon.com. The LF Show. That's patreon.com, The LF Show. While you're there, become a sustaining member. By doing that, you help us bring you radical, solution-based, independent media that is ad-free. And that's not just to you. The show airs free over the Pacifica Radio Network and is available free through PRX. If you want your community radio station to air the program, contact them or drop us an email and we'll follow up. That's podcast@lauraflanders.org. We are on a mission to double the number of radio stations carrying this show this year. And we're about halfway there with your help. Thanks.
Here at the Laura Flanders Show, we not only make podcasts, we listen to them. And one of my favorites recently is Mothers of Invention, co-hosted by former President of Ireland Mary Robinson and comedian Maeve Higgins. Mothers of Invention's not unlike our show in that it's all about uplifting amazing people doing remarkable things. In their case, it's all about climate justice. Robinson's got a new book out called Climate Justice. Maeve's a contributing opinion writer to the New York Times. Together, they bring you a brilliant and brilliantly humorous take on what actions are happening where and why women are in the forefront of the movement for climate justice. They're breaking the sound barrier, making a real difference over at Mothers of Invention. And I had a chance to talk with Mary Robinson about that work when we were both at a conference in Europe recently. Subscribe to our podcast and you won't miss that audio exclusive coming in early June. In the meantime, check out Mothers of Invention and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. You'll be glad you did.
This show is produced by yours truly, Laura Flanders, with Monica Mohapatra, Charlotte Carpenter, Nat Needham, Natasha Gaspar, Jeannie Hopper, Joanna Pinto, and Dominic Marcella. The Laura Flanders Show is made possible from the Novo, Ford, Tomcat, Cloud Mountain, and Fonda Foundations, as well as by listeners like you. So thank you. Stay kind, stay curious. Until the next time, I'm Laura.